I'm going to present some results of a recent survey that we made in Lisbon. We also made similar surveys in Turkey, in Istanbul, and in Brazil. Those are yet to be analyzed. And so I'm going to talk about this survey and these influences of residential satisfaction and residential preferences of teleworking during the COVID-19 pandemic. So the survey that we've made is basically, the idea was to analyze residential preferences, residential satisfaction, teleworking satisfaction, and its influence on the decision to telework in the future. So this was a survey, an online survey that we made, distributed to networks and through Facebook groups and through LinkedIn groups in Lisbon. It was a very long and boring survey. We had questions about social demographics, social economics, past travel patterns, basically commuting, past teleworking habits prior to the pandemic, teleworking habits during the different stages of the pandemic, then these questions about satisfaction and preferences, and finalizing it, we ended with a simplified 5 working days travel diary, in which we asked if people would telework or did not telework and which trips they did on those days. We are not going to analyze, I'm not going to analyze this here. So between May and June 2021, we deployed the survey. We got for Lisbon around 930 answers, of which a lot of them people gave up in the middle of the survey. Others had some issues, so we ended up not including them in our analysis. So we end up with 532 valid answers, a little bit around 60%. And the methods that we are going to use here, it's basically I'm going to start with some factor analysis on the issues about satisfaction and preferences, then trying to regress those resulting factors onto the social demographic locational characteristics of the individuals and travel patterns, and then finally using all of this data to an ordered logit model to try to explain the preference for teleworking in the future, or teleworking frequency in the future. So because the sample was collected through the internet, it's very biased towards more educated people. So we have 85% almost of people with at least a college degree. And we have a very important number of people holding a PhD degree, so it was very biased. It was mostly constituted of women, so there is a difference between the Lisbon Metropolitan Area, the last data in the census, and then regarding age, we have a slightly younger population than the Lisbon Metropolitan Area. But an interesting thing that I found out is that the average commuting time, it's quite similar of these people, is quite similar to the values to the average of the Lisbon Metropolitan Area, data collected in the last survey in 2017, and the commuting patterns by the modal commuting patterns are more or less similar to the data to the global modal shares in 2017. There are some changes that might explain these differences. The first one is that the data from the travel survey relates to all trips, and here we are just considering commuting. And in the meantime, there was a huge change in the pricing system of public transportation with a huge decrease in the prices. So this might explain the fact that we have much higher share of people commuting by transit than the global share previously in the Lisbon Metropolitan Area. So we had a series of Likert scales, and we ended by building three major groups of factors. The first one related with residential satisfaction, which came out with two factors. One, satisfaction with accessibility in the area surrounding the home, and the other one, satisfaction with the surrounding urban environment. So the first one basically relates to people being more or less satisfied with commuting distance, public transport services, accesses to shops and to public facilities. And the second one is about traffic volumes in the nearby vicinity, perceptions of safety, and the perceptions of the quality of the public space surrounding the home. Then about residential preferences, we came out with these three. So preference for an urban environment, which people say, I prefer to live in don't prefer to live in a quiet residential area, prefer to live in dynamic areas with commerce, restaurants, and so on, prefer to live in an apartment rather than in a detached house, and do not like to live in the countryside or in a village. Another one, which is preference for accessibility, so people liking to live in a place with very good access, not just to public facilities, but also to public transport and reducing their commuting distance. And then finally, a suburban preference that was called suburban preference, which is basically people that it's characterized by the fact people wanting to have privacy from their neighbors, prefer to live in places where they feel safe, live in places with easy road access and quiet places. And then the last group of factors was about questions that we asked people, a series of Likert questions about their telework satisfaction. And we have to take into consideration that this was made in a period where people had already a lot of experience, at least during the pandemic, although there was a relevant part of the sample that teleworked quite frequently before the pandemic in 2019. And so we have these three factors, one which is positive about telework, which is people that want to telework more and they feel safe and they feel happy with it, and they have good conditions to telework, which is in the second factor. And then the third factor, which is the reticence to engage into telework, which is basically related with the fact of not having enough space at home or enough conditions at home, but also feeling like they're going to be left behind in their jobs. And so we regressed this with a series of variables that we have about social economics, housing characteristics, residential and work locations, commuting and transport, all of the variables, and telework. What I'm just presenting here, because I included all the variables, I'm just presenting the ones that are at least significant at 85%. So which is 1 asterisk, then 2 asterisks is significant at 90%, and the 3, 95. And so what we can see is that most important, I would say, for the conclusions of this work is basically teleworking frequency is related with satisfaction about accessibility, and you have like people that were always on telework since the beginning of the pandemic will be less satisfied both with the surrounding urban environment and with accessibility. But for example, being a frequent teleworker, this will increase the satisfaction with accessibility, probably because the person doesn't need to commute as frequently as in the other case. But we can see that commuting time would decrease the satisfaction, and also commuting by private car will decrease the satisfaction with accessibility. And interesting enough is that people living in the suburbs in the south bank of the river Tejo will be more satisfied with the surrounding urban environment, and also people working in the exterior suburbs in the north bank of the Tejo in Lisbon, in municipalities in this area, will be more satisfied with accessibility, probably because they will be living in the suburbs and also working in the suburbs and not having to travel so much to the city center. Then the most interesting thing in our case in the residential preferences is that telework is negatively correlated with preferences for urban environment, which comes again to the issue that was already discussed by Patricia in some way, that the issue of self-selection and the issue of people that are teleworkers would want to live in the suburbs, and which has been reported by the literature that there is at least an association between teleworking practices prior to the pandemic and suburban living. In this case, we cannot say which one affects, because what can be seen is that there is an association, and probably it's multiple causality. So people might want to live in the suburbs, and then they say, oh, I can telecommute, then I will probably be able to pursue my preferences. But if, again, then they have an experience of telecommuting, that might also increase their preferences to suburban residences. And also, what we see, for example, is that people that has been always in telework since the beginning of the pandemic, this reduces their preferences for accessibility. So accessibility surrounding their nearby house or accessibility of their house ceases to be as important. We see also here some things like, for example, owning more cars will decrease your preferences for urban environment, which is something that has been also reported in the literature, but also preference for accessibility and increases suburban preferences. And also commuting time, the bigger the commuting time, reduces the preferences for urban environments. There is this result, which I haven't figured it out much what might be, because commuting by non-motorized modes reduces the preferences for urban environment. Then telework preferences, what can be seen here is that teleworking, at least partially, or the full days in the previous week of the survey, and also people that have been always teleworking since the beginning of the pandemic, they tend to be more positive about telework, which might be which might signify that people that experience telework, several of them might see this as an interesting avenue for their working life. There is also aspects related with housing. For example, owning a detached house basically decreases the reticence for telework, which basically is related once again with the characteristics and the conditions in their house. And also, people that commute longer times will have less reticence for engaging to telework. So both aspects that are more or less related with preferences, but also aspects that are related with constraints that we have on our daily life influence these preferences. And then the last stage was doing an ordered logit about the intention to telework. And once again, the biggest difference in this case is that we included the attitudes, whereas in the previous models there were no attitudes. But one interesting thing in here is that from the responses that we got, 51% of the respondents said that we would like to telework 3 or more days a week in the future. And 30% 1 or 2 days. So what I can say from this is that people that are mostly educated and have a college degree in some ways, or I'd say like service workers, more or less well-to-do, if they are given the chance, or at least they are saying that they will want to telework much more than do not telework. And this was the responses in our cases. So what we see here, so for example, and this we can result from, this gives us some ideas that there has no change in terms of the preferences that we might associate with teleworkers, is that people that have a preference for an urban environment and a preference for accessibility will not want to telework as much as the other ones. And then in the other case, having good conditions to telework at home, they will want to telework more, and people that have reticence to telework, they will not want to telework as much. Also, commuting distances, so commuting less than 15 minutes has a strong influence on the desire of not telework, as the same thing as commuting up to 30 minutes. So we can say that there might be some kind of a threshold. Below 30 minutes, people will say like, it's good enough to go from home to work to commute. One thing that I found also interesting is that millennials don't want to telework, which will be something that most people will associate that younger generations that are more digitally natives would want to telework. So what can be said from the results obtained here? So there is a strong support for future engagement in telework, at least I would say in the population with this type of characteristics. There was a recent article in an online newspaper in Portugal in which somebody made an analysis of all the distribution of jobs by job type and job description in Portugal, and that person came to the conclusion that the potential for telework in Portugal is 10% based on the professions. So this might say that telework might be a strong preference of certain groups of people, probably some, I would not call it urbanites, but at least metropolitanites, people living in the metropolitan areas and working in services or with intellectual professions, that they might want to telework, and some of them might have the idea, oh, it will be very nice to move towards the countryside and live there and while keep my job in the city. But the majority of the population will not be able to telework, or at least in the conditions that we say. So about the preferences, we can say that preferences about residential location influence the decision to telework. So less urban, the preferences are higher likelihood to telework. Of course, once again, we cannot ascertain where is the causality goes from. But it has also been seen that also these preferences have evolved through time. Or we can say that they might have evolved through time because there are an influence of previous behavioral patterns or teleworking habits, and also of residential location, and also of previous travel behavior. So what I can say from the results in here is that in some ways they are in accordance to the work that me and Patricia we have done regarding the data from the UK. So there is no great revolution in terms of what we looked in terms of like people that want to live in the countryside or want to live in the suburbs will tend to telecommute more. So this in some ways confirms this type of associations. Of course, there are ways, and this work can be improved, for example, by putting this all together in the same modeling framework and not stepwise. And some of the things might appear here because in the ordered logits, for example, the attitudes are there, and these attitudes were also influenced by social, economic, and travel characteristics, which were not significant in the order logit because they're already controlled by in those attitudes. So trying to see where this comes from these individual and locational characteristics towards the attitudes and then towards the decision to telework. And with this, I end up. And so thank you very much.